It's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, and that is Thom Allgaier. Thom is the Invasive Species Coordinator in the Division of Plant Industry at the New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. Thom has many irons in the fire, as they say, and while he's been busy the past few years coordinating the response to the invasive spotted lanternfly, today he will be speaking to us about the New York State Prohibited and Regulated Invasive Plant List. So thank you, Thom.
Hello, everyone. I hope you cannot hear the dogs barking in the background. I apologize if you can, but I'm just going to jump right in. So Part 575, the Invasive Species Regulation, is it's actually a New York State DEC regulation, not a New York State Ag and Markets regulation. And basically, the definition, at least for a working definition for New York State, invasive species are species that are non-native to a particular area and introduced can cause injury to humans, environment, or the economics of the area. So the important part there being and, just because something is non-native doesn't necessarily make it an invasive species. There are many very important things like cows and honeybees and apples that are introduced to the environment, but are not detriment. They're a benefit. So they're not, even though they're not native, they're beneficial, they're not invasive. So just keep that in mind. So the regulation and the lists actually, there's two lists, have come out of the New York State Invasive Species Task Force report, which was produced at the end of 2005. That task force consisted of state agencies, nonprofits, the prisms and others, as well as academic institutions. They came up with a long list of recommendations. One of them was to better coordinate and streamline invasive species regulatory process. The task force was co-chaired by New York State DEC and New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. The evolution of that has been the New York State Invasive Species Council, which is still co-hosted, co-chaired by DEC and Ag and Markets. The evolution of the task force kind of evolved into the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, which advises the council. The actual regulation is here in this link. You can browse the express terms of the regulation by clicking on the link when you have time. I won't get into that. It would put everyone to sleep, especially this hour. So the DEC regulation is Title VI, New York State, Part 575. Usually just referred to as Part 575. The part that I'm going to speak about today is specifically the plant side, not the animal side. It's kind of divided up where New York State Agriculture and Markets regulates the plant side, and New York State DEC manages the animal side. So as I mentioned, there are lists, not a single list. There's a prohibited list, plants that cannot or should not be sold because of their invasive species component. And then also there's a regulated list, plants that are invasive species, but in certain situations can be sold and used. So the prohibited plant list, basically what it boils down to is that prohibited invasive species can't be knowingly possessed with the intent to sell, import, purchase, transport, introduce, or propagate. Currently, there are 69 plants on the list. I'm not going to go through the entire list. Many of them are weed species that people normally wouldn't be cultivating in any way whatsoever. But there are plants on there that have historic horticultural importance. The list is here of both the regulated, and link here is for both the regulated and prohibited invasive species. If you want to have that, there's also printed brochures and a printed list. Those can be obtained through the New York State DEC website. One example here is a Chinese silvergrass that was found in the marketplace by one of our inspectors, and those plants were subsequently destroyed. One thing I want to touch on is how the plants got on the list. The task force produced a list of recommended plants. Those plants were vetted through a subcommittee. That list, the shortened list, then became that shortened list was used. There was an economic assessment conducted for each plant, and there was also it was a socioeconomic assessment, whether they were benefit or not to human health, cultural sensitivity, things like that, of economic value. And then also there was an environmental assessment. So there was two separate assessments for each plant. Those that ranked the highest were added to the list. That list is currently in process of being the entire regulation actually is in process of being revised, including the list. The EEC has been working on this for several years now. They're getting closer, but I know of no end line, so it's still in the process. There will be a public comment period and things like that, but that's a little bit further down the road. As far as the regulated plants, the plants that are regulated are species that cannot be knowingly introduced into a free living state. So if they're kept contained in a cultivated environment, they can be grown, they can be sold, but they have to be properly labeled. The plants here that our horticulture inspector came across, people were taking cuttings and selling things out of, styrofoam cups and things like that. That's kind of the nightmare scenario is, what is it, where did it come from? So we do get nurseries from out of state that ship things in because they're not familiar with the regulations in New York State. But it's up to the nurseries outside of New York State to label them before they enter commerce in New York State. So once they cross the state line, they're in commerce. So the originating nursery, if they're outside New York State, has to label them with the proper labeling to be compliant with the regulated plants under Part 575 before they enter the state. And then the nursery selling them here in New York State has to keep them labeled. Some of the plants that are on the regulated list, or all the plants that are on the regulated list, are black locust, burning bush, Chinese silvergrasses, and then Japanese virgin barrow, which is a clematis, Norway maple, and winter creeper. Here's a picture of one of the Norway maples that are properly labeled and tagged. I don't know if you can see the small print, but there's very distinct font sizing and word and verbiage to the signs, although the sign types, the labeling is variable. The plant tags like this, they can be stickers on the pot itself, or it can be a sign in front of the plants. This black leaf, dark red leaf variety of Norway maple is often found in the nursery trade, typically used as a street tree or an ornamental. Those are allowable, but not if it's going to be planted in an area where it's just going to grow wild. It has to be in a cultivated situation. As I mentioned, Chinese silvergrass earlier, there are conditionally exempt cultivars. So things that have been proven to be sterile. There's been scientific research, and that's been petitioned to New York State DEC and Ag and Markets, and that goes through an approval process. So these conditionally exempt cultivars, and I say conditionally because if they're originally assumed to be sterile, and then turns out later that they actually can reproduce from seed or root growth or things like that, then they can come off the exempt list. That's why they're conditionally exempt. It's not a forever situation. So the two varieties of silvergrass that are exempt are My Fair Maiden and Scout. If you find any others in the marketplace, they're not exempt and they can't be sold. The same goes for winter creeper. There are two exempt cultivars, Cuiensis and Vanilla Frosting. There were four Japanese barberry varieties that were exempt in 2022. I almost said last year, but it's already 2024. In 2022, Mr. Green Jeans was also added to the exempt cultivar list. So now there's 5 varieties of Japanese barberry. The picture on the right here is Crimson Cutie, We've been seeing that in the marketplace probably the last 3 years. There were a few previous to that, but there are very few in the marketplace. So we are starting to see some of these exempt cultivars being offered for sale. The newest addition was Mr. Green Jeans. There's a variety, kind of that chartreuse green, barberry. One benefit of barberry is deer resistant. So it's a very popular plant in certain areas. It's another reason to have why it's allowed to be sold. It does fit a certain need. To be conditionally exempt, again, scientific research has to be put forward. And there's a form and a process that has to be presented by a grower in order to get on the list. So what's not conditionally exempt? Everything else. Here's an example of another barberry variety that is not exempt. They make claims that it's not invasive, as you can see on the side, but no scientific research has been put forward to New York State DEC or ag markets in order to kind of vet that process. They can claim that it's not invasive. It may be approved in other states, but not in New York State. So if you see anything other than those exempt cultivars that are conditionally exempt, or the very few plants that are on the regulated list, just contact New York State DEC or us. It's better off contacting us because we can respond faster, and we'll send our horticulture inspectors out to the marketplace and try to find out where they came from and cut off that pathway, or suggest that they produce, scientific research that shows that it actually is sterile and non-invasive. So how many lists when we talk about invasive species in Part 575, how many lists are there? You can respond in the chat if you have time. So there is a prohibited plant list and there's a regulated plant list. So there's really two lists. There are exemptions to that list. Like I said, there's conditionally exempt cultivars, but there are two lists. There's the regulated list and the prohibited list. Their seeds are not allowed in bird seed. That was a question that somebody had.
So I was curious about this one. So it sounds like somebody purchased their home, which I don't know if that falls under the cultivated designation, but so in that situation, they had Japanese barberry, black locust, and Norway maple. And even though, it's someone's yard and it's technically cultivated, now they're escaping to adjacent properties. So what is technically the definition of cultivated, and would somebody's yard be considered that? And what are the consequences of it escaping to an adjacent property, whether that's someone's home or like a woodlot?
Well, existing plantings of all those plants are not within the regulation. It's new plants, new sales, that sort of thing, that the regulation covers. They were for many years, barberry, Norway maple, and others were sold in the marketplace, and they were planted in landscapes and street trees and things like that. So it's not the planted trees that really fall under Part 575. It's the ones that are being offered for sale and actively being propagated, things like that. So it would be up to the homeowner to remove those invasive species if they see fit. There is no funding or grants or anything like that or assistance for those, although you can contact the PRISMs, which are the Partnerships for Invasive Species Management. They may be able to help in some situations, depending on what region you're in, depending on what the plant is. But yes, some of those plants can spread into wild areas. But as far as being cultivated, it's just a matter of maintaining it, mowing around it, removing any seedlings, things like that.
Great. Another question that came in was whether DEC or Department of Ag and Markets has done any field trials on the exempted barberry varieties to see if they produce viable seed.
New York State and DEC have, or Ag and Markets and DEC have not. Some of the academic partners have, University of Connecticut being one of them. And I believe Cornell has also done some So we have not within the department, but some of our educational partners have. So,
Great. And we'll do one more question before we transition. So the question was, can educators move specimens of prohibited plants for educational purposes? Like, I don't know if that's both across counties, but also maybe across state borders.
uh, I'm not. You'd have to check with the other states as far as going across state borders. But intrastate within New York State, it is permissible for educational purposes. But I believe there's a permitting system through DEC.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Tom. So we will transition now to our IPM Minute presentation. And the goal of this is a really quick introduction to a topic that is relevant in terms of the time frame. So right now, and we thought that since we just talked about prohibited and regulated invasive plants, that it would be helpful to talk about an alternative. And so for that presentation, I'd like to introduce Krissy Boys. Krissy is a natural areas horticulturist with the Cornell Botanic Gardens, where she teaches classes and offers workshops about a variety of topics relative to native plants and native plant communities. So today, Krissy will offer some insights about choosing native plants. So thank you, Krissy.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so I have a few things on the screen. This is going to be really fast so that you'll have them to look back on through the YouTube recording. So there's some new publications out that will help you figure out what you might like to do in your gardens and possibly your natural areas if you have some. And then the Cornell Botanic Gardens and Department of Entomology teamed up a few years ago to produce this booklet, which is in link form at the bottom of the page. And this is this is an image of the garden at the Judd Falls Road entrance to the Mundy Wildflower Garden, where I've been looking after that garden for a number of years. And the Department of Entomology actually found the insects in this garden, which then was the impetus for the booklet that was lovingly put together by Maria Van Dyke, Brian Danforth, and Scott McCart, and Rosemary Parker, Robert Wesley, and myself. So just to understand what is a native plant, it's one that grows in the same habitat it originated in. And plants can be native to continents, states, or regions. Understanding this and understanding also what is local genotype, what is an ecoregion, how do they help define genotype? When we say straight species, what does that mean? And can we use cultivars? All revolve around what is an ecoregion and how they're defined by land, water, geology, and plant communities. Looking at the whole United States, you can see how these outlines of ecoregions cross state boundaries. So they don't follow what the state says is New York State. And then there's several throughout the Northeast. We are located right here and in and around that just about the, let's see, follow my cursor, right here in the middle of this area, the Northern Appalachian Plateau and uplands of the Finger Lakes. And when we get even shrink it down even smaller, what are the habitats of the Cayuga Lake Basin? What is our ecoregion made of? And it's all of these. So we have very dry uplands, we have these lovely old fields, we have bogs and fens. And this is the Mundy Wildflower Garden. It's a floodplain forest, a unique habitat. And of course, we have the lake cliffs. So thinking about plants that you can use in your garden and how to grow them and where to find them. Asters, goldenrod, and grasses are the best choice to start with. They're common, they're available widely, they're easy to grow, and they're just lovely to see, and insects rely on them. So here's a shot of the entrance garden at Mundy, pointing out some of the grasses that you may never be familiar with if someone didn't introduce you to, say, bottlebrush grass, or riverbank riparian rye, coupled here with Rudbeckia laciniata and our New York ironweed. The goldenrods are these in particular, you know, sometimes they're given they have a bad reputation as taking over whole fields, but there are few of what I call the civilized goldenrods. And this is an example of them, the early goldenrod, the wreath goldenrod and gray goldenrod, and the bicolor goldenrod. Also zigzag goldenrod. And then there's this little known goldenrod that occurs in the median strip of the highways along, Route 13 near the airport, seaside goldenrod that's very adapted to salt. Different heights that are suitable for the home garden. And then thinking about all of them in combination, they definitely are the cornerstones of a meadow planting. And that's what we want to try to encourage people to do, to reduce their lawns by, if you have expansive lawns, you could shrink it right from meadow down to more native plants in the bed surrounding what area you want to call your lawn. And then there's resources here. The Garden Fair plant sale in Ithaca will be in early May at the farmers market. By October, we're collecting seeds with the Native Plant Society. And in December, those seeds are made available at what we call the Solstice Gathering. Cornell Botanic Garden will have a plant sale in June or sometime around June. Volunteer at the Monday Wildflower Garden. And then your local nurseries. These are the places you want to hit for sources of plants. The Plantsman is well established, Peruville Road. White Oak Nursery, well established out in Canandaigua. Amanda's Garden, very well established in Springwater, New York. And two new ones, Go Native Perennials in Skaneateles and Grow Wild right here in Brooktondale. Yeah, so there's a link to that booklet, and you're welcome to find out more about native plants. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krissy. We did have a couple questions come in. One came in earlier, and I feel like this is a question that you might be best to address. So the person asked, a lot of people look down at anything in the garden that's non-native. So they would like to know if you could make an argument for going all native, especially in pollinator gardens, even if there's some benefits to non-native in terms of maybe more flowers or higher nectar content or something. So is there an argument for all native?
There definitely is, and that's knowing who's who in the world that wants our native plants and why. So you can argue that point by saying we have generalist and specialist insects, and we can provide for the generalists very easily, but we really have to work much harder to provide for the specialists. So that booklet is your key to knowing which insect is looking for which plant, because they absolutely rely on that plant. And they cannot live without that plant. They can't thrive, they can't reproduce. Just in general, we have the non-native, non-invasive, list that is very welcome in our gardens, and we encourage people to use them. So there's quite a number of plants that you can add in that will have for decades, generations fallen into that non-native, non-invasive category. So they're sure bets. Yeah, so you have an argument. Specialists.
And I think one of the other arguments that I hear is, native plants are better adapted to the region where you live. So maybe they require fewer inputs like less watering and other, environmental amendments that they'll just survive better than an introduced plant.
Absolutely. Far fewer, not during the establishment phase, so that's often left out. But when you're growing plants, you have to grow them, the same way you would grow anything. And when you put in a little plant into a drought year, you must water it in. But once it's established, yeah, they create their own engines, and they're on their way. Someone just put in a nice question there about invasive species and working with an invaded landscape. Is that what I saw quickly? I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, so some great examples to see test cases here at the Monday Wildflower Garden is our restoration slope area, where students have been able to weed buckthorn, privet, rosa multiflora, Norway maple, just 50 different invasive species that we have here right in the Mundy Wildflower Garden, and then use seeds and plugs to create a new landscape. Yeah, native plants in the landscape is key. So by taking those plants out and monitoring, knowing that you're going to have a seed bank, residual seed bank, so you may need to be hand weeding, or you may need to use herbicide if you choose, judiciously, of course. We use a lot of, the smallest amount in the most careful application. So cut and paint, or drip would be recommended if you have a large woody invasive plant population. Otherwise, there's mechanical weed wrenches and shovels and potato forks and just young backs work really well. Being careful of always telling people to bend their knees.
Wonderful. Thank you, Krissy, and thank you, Tom,
Welcome.
for your presentations today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope that you continue to join our future events. Next month, we'll be talking about changes to home garden insecticides in New York State, and then also the tick blitz. So you can learn more about the tick distribution in New York and maybe participate in that process. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend.